The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The Mirage of Victory. April 6, 1943. The sun hung low over Berlin, casting long shadows over the grand, brutalist buildings. Inside the Führer's headquarters, Hitler sat, tense but resolute, listening to his generals' optimistic reports. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, as the Luftwaffe's successes seemed endless, yet the skies were about to tell a different story. The mood in the room was one of unshakable confidence, a mirage of victory carefully crafted by his most trusted officers. For months, they had assured him of their superiority in the skies, spinning tales of aerial dominance over the Eastern Front and the ongoing campaign in the West. But beneath this facade, the reality was beginning to fracture. Hitler, a man who had built his vision of the Reich upon the illusion of invincibility, was slowly coming face to face with the stark truths his generals had been hiding. As the day wore on, the tension in the Führer's inner circle became palpable. A handful of intelligence reports and intercepted communications had begun to paint a different picture, one that did not align with the glowing reports flooding Hitler's desk. The Luftwaffe, which had once enjoyed air superiority, was now losing crucial ground to the Allies. The Eastern Front was no longer the promising territory it had once been. In North Africa, the German forces were barely holding their ground against the British Eighth Army. But Hitler, always cautious about accepting bad news, brushed aside any doubts raised by his more skeptical advisers. His generals, however, were beginning to realize that their attempts to shield him from the truth were no longer sustainable. It wasn't long before the cracks began to show. Hitler had long been a man of grand vision, but this was a moment of clarity, one in which his generals would either face the consequences of their deceit or confront the truth. The mirage of victory, which had been so carefully constructed by the Luftwaffe and the Army's top brass, was starting to dissolve like smoke in the air. The Führer, who had once surrounded himself with sycophants, began to wonder whether he could trust anyone in his inner circle. The tipping point came when Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, arrived at the headquarters to deliver a report. Göring, always the brash and self-assured leader, had confidently presented the Luftwaffe's position as unassailable. Yet, the reality painted by the intelligence reports was anything but reassuring. The Allies, with their relentless bombing campaigns, had begun to cripple German industrial infrastructure. Göring's words, once infused with absolute confidence, now seemed like empty rhetoric, and for the first time, Hitler's eyes flickered with doubt. Göring, sensing the shift, tried to reassure Hitler, but the Führer was no longer listening with his usual fervor. The reports that Hitler had brushed aside for so long were now undeniable. His generals, those he had trusted to maintain the myth of German invincibility, had failed to deliver. As the discussion grew more heated, it became clear that a rift had formed between Hitler and his inner circle. His generals, who had once prided themselves on their ability to manage the war's narrative, could no longer keep up the illusion. This was the day when the facade of victory finally crumbled before Hitler's eyes. The Luftwaffe's losses were becoming too significant to ignore, and the Eastern Front was a far cry from the victory that had been promised. Hitler's reliance on his generals had led him down a path of denial, but now the cold reality of the war was seeping through the cracks in his plans. As he left the meeting that day, the weight of betrayal hung heavily on his shoulders. His generals had lied to him, not just in their reports but in the very fabric of the empire he had dreamed of building. The myth of German invincibility, once unshakable, was beginning to unravel, and Hitler was left to confront the consequences of his own blind faith in those who had deceived him. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The golden age of German aviation. In the winter of 1941, the German Luftwaffe had been unmatched. Its sleek fighters and bombers soared above Europe, striking terror into the hearts of Allied forces. The sound of their engines was a death knell, and for a brief moment, Hitler's ambitions appeared unstoppable. But power on the ground doesn't always translate to power in the air. The Luftwaffe's supremacy was an illusion that, like all things in wartime, was bound to fade. What had initially seemed like an unshakable foundation for Nazi conquest would soon crumble under the weight of overstretched resources, mismanagement, and the evolving strategies of the Allies. The Golden Age of German aviation, as many would later call it, was, in fact, a fleeting period of triumph that could not sustain the Reich's aggressive expansion. In the early stages of World War II, the Luftwaffe was the crown jewel of Hitler's military machine. Their blitzkrieg tactics, fast, overwhelming assaults, were devastatingly effective. The planes, like the iconic Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the formidable Stuka dive bombers, became symbols of German power, dominating the skies over Poland, France, and even the early stages of the Soviet Union invasion. For Hitler, the Luftwaffe was more than a weapon. It was a statement of German superiority. The skies were his domain, and in his mind they were as much a part of his vision of world domination as the land below. However, as the war dragged on, cracks began to appear in this once pristine facade. The Luftwaffe's early successes had been predicated on the element of surprise and the rapid concentration of force. Yet, as the Allies adapted, so too did their ability to fight back. The Battle of Britain in 1940 was the first sign that German air superiority was not as secure as it seemed. Despite initial successes, the Luftwaffe could not break the resilience of the Royal Air Force, RAF, which had the benefit of radar technology and a highly effective defensive strategy. The Germans had failed to anticipate the resilience of the British and their ability to recover from early losses. This was a harbinger of things to come. By 1943, as the Luftwaffe faced increasing losses from Allied bombing raids, the true scale of the problem became clear. The German air forces, once feared across Europe, had begun to falter. Their planes were being shot down in greater numbers, and their capacity to replace lost aircraft was dwindling. The constant pressure from the Royal Air Force and the growing might of the U.S. Army Air Forces left the Luftwaffe in a defensive posture. Hitler's generals had been assuring him that they would maintain control of the skies, but these assurances were becoming increasingly hollow. At this point, the deterioration of the Luftwaffe's power began to have serious repercussions for Hitler's war strategy. The very air supremacy that had facilitated rapid victories across Europe now became a source of immense vulnerability. German bombers, once able to strike deep into enemy territory with impunity, were now being shot down in droves. The loss of air superiority meant the Germans were no longer able to provide close air support for their ground forces, nor were they able to protect the German cities from relentless Allied bombing raids. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, carefully maintained by Göring and other senior officers, was beginning to unravel, exposing cracks in the overall Nazi war machine. The reality was that the Luftwaffe had become a victim of its own overextension. With limited resources and a growing number of fronts to defend, it was increasingly difficult to maintain the high levels of effectiveness that had been seen in the early years of the war. Hitler's insistence on grandiose offensive strategies and his interference in military tactics had left the Luftwaffe overburdened and underprepared for a long-term fight. Instead of focusing on strategic priorities, the Luftwaffe had been tasked with fighting in multiple theaters simultaneously, from the Eastern Front to North Africa and the Mediterranean. The moment that Hitler began to realize the extent of the Luftwaffe's decline was a pivotal one. On the surface, his generals continued to offer reports of success, but the evidence of defeat was becoming too overwhelming to ignore. The air superiority that had once been the backbone of the Nazi war effort had evaporated. The Luftwaffe's losses in the skies over Germany and occupied Europe were now a constant, and the once feared Stuka bombers, known for their terrifying dive-bombing tactics, were increasingly unable to operate without heavy losses. As the war continued, Hitler's realization grew more acute. The myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility had been shattered, and with it, the myth of a German victory in the skies. The golden age of German aviation, which had provided him with hope and momentum in the early years of the war, had come to a screeching halt. The scales had tipped, and Hitler would soon be forced to confront the fact that the war in the air was no longer his to win. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The Battle of Britain. The First Awakening. August 1940. Over southern England, the first cracks in the Luftwaffe's invincibility began to show. The roar of Spitfires and Hurricanes pierced the air, their pilots pushing their machines to the limit in a fight for survival. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe's commanders insisted victory was just around the corner, but the Luftwaffe's losses were mounting, and their fate was beginning to shift. The Battle of Britain, one of the most intense aerial engagements in history, marked a turning point not only for the war, but for Hitler's perception of his military leaders. What had begun as an optimistic campaign to secure air superiority over Britain and pave the way for a German invasion was now revealing serious flaws in both strategy and execution. As the skies over Britain darkened with the constant roar of combat, the cracks in the German war machine began to widen, signaling the beginning of the end for the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. The Luftwaffe had been designed to dominate the skies. Under the direction of Hermann Göring, it was a powerful force, well equipped with technologically advanced aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. These planes, coupled with the devastating blitzkrieg tactics on the ground, had enabled Germany to rapidly conquer much of Europe. For Hitler, air superiority was central to his ambitions, and the Luftwaffe's successes seemed to affirm his vision of a fast, victorious war. But as the Battle of Britain unfolded, the realities of aerial warfare began to challenge this image. The German strategy for the Battle of Britain had been to break the morale of the British people by targeting their cities and infrastructure, all while crippling the Royal Air Force, RAF. Initially, the Luftwaffe had made significant inroads, destroying airfields and attacking RAF squadrons. But Britain's pilots, particularly those flying the iconic Spitfires and Hurricanes, proved to be a formidable challenge. The British radar system, still in its infancy, gave the RAF a crucial advantage by allowing them to detect incoming German bombers before they could strike. This technological edge, combined with the courage and skill of the RAF pilots, turned the tide of the battle. In Berlin, however, the Luftwaffe's commanders clung to the belief that victory was imminent. They presented daily reports to Hitler that painted a picture of success. Göring, ever the optimist, reassured the Führer that the RAF was on the brink of collapse. Yet, behind these reports lay a growing reality. The Luftwaffe was suffering catastrophic losses, both in aircraft and experienced pilots. The once vaunted air superiority was slipping away, and the German planes were being shot down in increasing numbers. The RAF's resolve was hardening, and the Luftwaffe's initial advantage in numbers and strength was dwindling. As the battle dragged on through the summer of 1940, the mounting losses began to make themselves felt. By early September, the Luftwaffe's strategy shifted, and it began to target London and other major cities instead of military installations. This strategic shift, known as the Blitz, was an attempt to break British morale by terrorizing civilians, but it had little effect on the war's outcome. In fact, it proved to be a critical error, as it allowed the RAF to regroup, train new pilots, and recover from the initial blows. Meanwhile, German pilots were becoming increasingly fatigued, and their equipment was suffering under the relentless pace of the campaign. Hitler, who had once placed his absolute trust in the reports from his generals, began to sense that something was amiss. The optimistic briefings he had received were no longer matching the visible signs of failure on the battlefield. The realization was slow, but unmistakable. The Luftwaffe's dominance over Britain was no longer assured. The generals, who had once projected confidence, began to waver in their assurances. But by this point, it was too late. Hitler's pride and stubbornness kept him from acknowledging the full extent of the Luftwaffe's failure until the signs were undeniable. The Battle of Britain revealed the limits of the Luftwaffe's power and exposed the flaws in Hitler's war strategy. His reliance on air superiority had failed, and with it, the vision of a swift, uncontested victory in the West began to crumble. The Germans had underestimated the resilience of the British, as well as the ability of the RAF to recover and continue the fight. The once feared Luftwaffe had failed to break Britain, and Hitler, who had expected the skies to bend to his will, now had to confront the sobering reality of an enemy that had stood firm. For the first time, Hitler began to see that his generals had not been entirely truthful with him. They had insisted that victory was just around the corner, but the facts on the ground told a different story. The Battle of Britain was the first major blow to the myth of German invincibility, and it marked the beginning of a shift in Hitler's perception of the war. His generals, who had painted a picture of inevitable triumph, could no longer hide the truth. The Luftwaffe had failed to secure the skies, and with it, the prospects for a quick victory in the West had been dashed. This was the moment when the first cracks in Hitler's faith in his military leaders began to appear. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The overconfidence of Göring. For Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief, victory was a given. Every report from the front lines was greeted with applause, every loss dismissed as an anomaly. His assurances to Hitler were unwavering, but beneath his confidence lay a growing sense of unease among his subordinates. The men flying the planes knew the truth. Göring's words didn't always match the reality of the sky. His overwhelming self-assurance, which had once been seen as a source of strength, began to erode the trust of those who were actually fighting the war. As the Luftwaffe's losses mounted and the Allies adapted to their tactics, Göring's overconfidence became one of the key factors that contributed to the unraveling of Hitler's belief in the Luftwaffe's invincibility. Göring's rise to power had been built on a reputation as a fighter pilot during World War I, and his charisma made him one of Hitler's most trusted allies. He was a man of immense stature, both physically and politically, and his initial success as head of the Luftwaffe reinforced his aura of invincibility. From the start of the war, he projected confidence, assuring Hitler that the Luftwaffe could crush any resistance the Allies might pose. His initial successes during the early stages of the war, especially in the Battle of France and the Blitzkrieg tactics that helped bring down much of Europe, gave him an almost unshakable sense of superiority. However, as the war continued, Göring's optimism began to clash with the realities on the ground. One of his greatest failures was his dismissal of the mounting evidence of the Luftwaffe's struggle. Rather than acknowledge the increasing difficulty of securing air superiority, he persisted in offering assurances that the situation was under control. In his reports to Hitler, Göring painted a picture of progress and impending victory, downplaying the effects of Allied air superiority and the growing losses within his own forces. His unwavering confidence, while meant to reassure the Führer, only served to further distance him from the harsh realities his subordinates were facing. While Göring's lavish lifestyle and political maneuvering often overshadowed his actual involvement in military planning, The pilots in the field could no longer ignore the increasing difficulties of their campaigns. The Luftwaffe's losses were becoming unsustainable, yet Göring continued to tell Hitler that they were on the brink of victory. His insistence on repeating the narrative of inevitable success, regardless of the facts, not only weakened his credibility, but also fostered disillusionment among the Luftwaffe's officers. They began to see him as more of a figurehead than a genuine military leader. The gap between Göring's assurances and the grim reality of the front lines became impossible to ignore. The growing resentment against Göring was not just limited to his officers. It extended to the rank and file, Luftwaffe pilots who, increasingly aware of the truth, began to feel the weight of the situation. As more experienced pilots were lost in combat, and the Luftwaffe struggled to replace them, the once feared German Air Force was showing signs of strain. Allied forces were adapting to German tactics, countering Luftwaffe attacks with increasing effectiveness. The Allied bombing campaigns over Germany became more frequent and devastating, and the Luftwaffe could no longer provide adequate defense. Even the Luftwaffe's vaunted air superiority over the Eastern Front began to falter, as Soviet forces gained ground and developed countermeasures to neutralize the German advantage. Göring, however, remained largely insulated from the consequences of these setbacks. His position as Hitler's right-hand man protected him from immediate scrutiny, and he continued to exude an air of invincibility. Yet, as the reality of the Luftwaffe's decline became undeniable, cracks began to show in Göring's once unshakable confidence. His repeated assurances to Hitler that victory was within reach no longer rang true. Despite the mounting losses, Göring would not admit the truth of the situation, as it would mean acknowledging that his leadership had failed. Instead, he deflected blame and maintained the illusion of progress. By 1943, as the Allies launched devastating air campaigns against German cities, Göring's role in the downfall of the Luftwaffe became increasingly clear. His overconfidence and refusal to accept the reality of the Luftwaffe's shortcomings left him unable to adapt to the changing nature of aerial warfare. His failure to innovate or respond effectively to new Allied tactics ultimately led to his downfall in the eyes of Hitler. While Göring maintained his grip on power within the Third Reich, his credibility with the Führer began to erode, and his reputation as a military leader was forever tarnished. It was during this period that Hitler, once fully trusting of Göring, began to see the depth of the Luftwaffe's failure. The reality of the situation was too stark to ignore, and Hitler's growing distrust of his generals became more pronounced. Göring's overconfidence, once a cornerstone of his authority, had now become a liability, leaving Hitler to realize that his most trusted military leader had failed to deliver on the promises of victory. The lie was finally exposed. The Luftwaffe's superiority was nothing more than an illusion, and the men who had convinced Hitler of its invincibility were no longer capable of winning the war. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The rise of the Allies' air power. As 1943 unfolded, the Allies' air forces began to transform. The American B-17 Flying Fortress, armed and ready, and the British Lancasters, now airborne in greater numbers than ever before, had begun to claw back control of the skies. The Luftwaffe's superiority was eroding. Hitler, however, remained steadfast in his belief. His generals were not prepared for the shift that was coming. By early 1943, the tide of the air war in Europe had shifted dramatically. Throughout the preceding years of World War II, the German Luftwaffe had maintained a dominant presence over Europe, using tactical bombing and aerial superiority to support the Wehrmacht's aggressive land campaigns. However, as the year progressed, Allied air forces began to make significant inroads into this once unshakable control. The heavy bombers of the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, and the Royal Air Force, RAF, had grown stronger, more numerous, and better equipped with advanced weaponry and tactics that began to erode the Luftwaffe's edge. While Hitler's generals initially downplayed the growing strength of the Allied air forces, they could no longer deny the obvious losses mounting across German territory. One of the most significant turning points was the sustained Allied bombing campaign against German industrial and military targets. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a four-engine heavy bomber, became the symbol of American air power. It was heavily armed with machine guns and designed to endure high-altitude combat, making it formidable against Luftwaffe interceptors. With improved navigation technology and bomb-aiming systems, the B-17s were able to strike deep into German territory, targeting key infrastructure such as factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. Meanwhile, the British Lancasters, known for their long range and heavy bomb loads, became equally important. In the summer of 1943, the British launched the devastating raids over the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, crippling its ability to produce war materials. Despite these mounting pressures, Hitler continued to be out of touch with the realities of the changing war. His generals, many of whom had already seen firsthand the increasing effectiveness of Allied airstrikes, were hesitant to speak candidly with the Führer about the dire situation in the skies. Hitler's belief in German technological superiority and his disdain for the strategic bombing campaigns led him to dismiss the concerns of his military advisors. His overconfidence in the Luftwaffe's ability to recover, combined with his failure to listen to the reality on the ground, led to a dangerous disconnect between him and his generals. This inability to accept the shifting balance of power in the air led to disastrous decisions. Hitler's reluctance to heed warnings from his Air Force commanders and other military experts meant that Germany's strategic response to the growing threat was slow and ineffective. As the Allies intensified their bombing campaign, the Luftwaffe was stretched thin, and its ability to mount a meaningful defense faltered. The Germans' dependence on outdated tactics and an unwillingness to adapt to the evolving nature of aerial combat created a fatal flaw in their strategy. The battle for control of the skies was not just about bombers and fighters. It was a battle for the very heart of the German war machine. As the Luftwaffe struggled to respond to the increasing number of Allied aircraft, Germany's ability to produce war materials was severely hampered. The raids over industrial centers and transportation hubs paralyzed the Nazi war economy, making it increasingly difficult to maintain a sustained military effort on both the eastern and western fronts. German cities, once centers of innovation and industry, now faced the growing devastation of repeated airstrikes that left entire areas in ruins. Yet, even as the Luftwaffe faltered, Hitler remained detached from the harsh reality of the war's changing dynamics. The fall of his air superiority would soon lead to the downfall of his broader military strategy, but he could not see it. His generals, too fearful of his wrath, failed to give him the unvarnished truth. As Allied air superiority continued to grow, the Allies' strategic bombing campaign reached new levels of intensity, and Hitler's blind belief in the invincibility of his military forces only hastened Germany's ultimate collapse. By the time he realized his error, it was too late. The rise of the Allies' air power had shifted the course of the war, sealing the fate of the Third Reich. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The battle for the skies over Germany. By the spring of 1943, German air superiority was faltering. Allied bombing raids grew larger, more precise. In the high clouds over the Reich, the first encounters between German and Allied bombers would set the stage for a brutal reckoning. The sound of Luftwaffe engines, once a symbol of dominance, had become a warning. As the Luftwaffe's grip on the skies weakened, the Allies were gaining an upper hand in the air, and the battlefield above Germany was rapidly becoming the site of an escalating confrontation. The key turning point came in 1943 with the Allied strategic bombing campaign, which aimed not only to destroy key military and industrial targets, but also to break the will of the German people. By then, the Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies in the early years of the war, found itself overwhelmed by the sheer scale and coordination of the Allied air forces. The Allies' new strategy involved daylight precision bombing, primarily carried out by the U.S. 8th Air Force. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its heavily armed defensive positions, was designed for this role, bringing a new level of firepower to the skies over Germany. The goal was to cripple Germany's war economy by targeting key industrial zones, transportation lines, and military infrastructure. For the first time in the war, the Allies were striking deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to defend its homeland like never before. This shift in tactics created a terrifying environment for the Germans. The Luftwaffe, which had previously been able to launch surprise attacks on Allied bombers over enemy territory, now found itself in a defensive posture, having to fight off massive waves of B-17s escorted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. These American bombers were more resilient than ever before, capable of withstanding significant damage while continuing their mission. The Luftwaffe, still reeling from the losses in North Africa and the Soviet Union, struggled to keep up with the overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft. At first, German fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 attempted to engage the bombers, but the Allies' increasing air superiority made it difficult for the Luftwaffe to mount an effective defense. The P-47s, armed with heavy machine guns and equipped with long-range fuel tanks, provided crucial bomber protection, often engaging German interceptors before they could reach the B-17s. This escort tactic proved highly effective, significantly reducing the vulnerability of Allied bombers to Luftwaffe attacks. The pressure on the Luftwaffe reached its peak during the Battle of the Ruhr in 1943, when the Allies launched a series of coordinated raids over key industrial targets in the heart of Germany. The destruction of the German synthetic oil plants, such as those at Ploiești in Romania, and attacks on factories in the Ruhr Valley severely hampered Germany's ability to sustain its war machine. The Luftwaffe's response was chaotic and largely ineffective. Many of its best pilots had already been lost in previous battles, and those left behind were increasingly unable to deal with the overwhelming numbers and firepower of the Allied forces. In addition to these challenges, the strategic bombing campaign placed a massive strain on the German military leadership. Hitler, whose overconfidence in the Luftwaffe had previously prevented him from acknowledging the changing dynamics of the war, was forced to confront a grim reality. The Luftwaffe could no longer maintain the same level of dominance over the skies that it once had. Hitler's generals, many of whom had long recognized the shift in power, began to speak out more forcefully about the need to adjust their strategies. However, Hitler's stubbornness and refusal to accept the reality of the situation made it difficult for his generals to speak honestly. The growing pressure from the skies above, however, could not be ignored for long. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer a threat capable of deterring Allied air raids. The once formidable German fighters were outnumbered, and their training and morale had diminished significantly. Allied bombers, with their greater numbers, were able to bomb with impunity, making deep penetrations into German territory. The skies above the Reich had become a battleground that would continue to push both sides to the brink. The consequences of this aerial shift were far-reaching. The bombing raids crippled Germany's economy and its ability to resupply its frontline forces, both on the eastern and western fronts. The Allies, bolstered by their increasing air superiority, now had a significant advantage in both the strategic and tactical domains. Hitler, by then, could no longer deny the devastation being wrought above Germany's cities and factories. His generals, who had warned him of the growing threat, were finally vindicated. However, it was too late. The Luftwaffe could no longer stem the tide of destruction descending from the skies. The battle for the skies. Over Germany was lost, and with it, Germany's chances of victory in World War II began to slip further away. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The Luftwaffe's strain, May 1943. The Luftwaffe was beginning to show the signs of wear. Pilots returned from missions, eyes sunken and weary, their aircraft battered from encounters with relentless enemy bombers and fighters. Supplies were low, and the toll of attrition was becoming painfully clear to anyone willing to see it. By the spring of 1943, the once feared German Luftwaffe, which had been the dominant force in Europe during the early years of World War II, was beginning to buckle under the immense pressure of the Allied air assault. The Luftwaffe had, until this point, maintained air superiority over much of Europe, allowing the German military to execute its rapid blitzkrieg tactics. However, the changing dynamics of the war, particularly the escalating Allied bombing campaigns, were beginning to stretch the Luftwaffe's resources thin. The continuous loss of experienced pilots, aircraft, and strategic initiative meant that the German Air Force was now fighting a defensive battle, one it was increasingly ill-equipped to win. The most immediate and obvious sign of the Luftwaffe's strain was the diminishing number of operational aircraft. While the Allies had been able to increase their production of bombers and fighters, the Germans were facing severe shortages. Aircraft were being patched together after each mission, with mechanics working tirelessly to keep damaged planes in the air. But even the best maintenance could not hide the fact that the Luftwaffe's fleet was aging rapidly. Many of the planes being sent into combat had been in service for years, and their ability to withstand the ferocity of Allied raids was limited. The once legendary Messerschmitt Bf-19, though still formidable in skilled hands, was showing signs of wear, and newer models such as the Focke-Wulf FW-190, while effective, were not enough to counter the overwhelming numbers of Allied bombers. The true cost of the attrition, however, lay in the pilots. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots who had honed their skills during the early phases of the war were being killed or captured in increasing numbers. The young recruits sent to replace them were often ill-prepared and lacked the combat experience needed to take on the Allied bomber formations. The situation became dire as seasoned. Pilots were lost in the chaos of battle, their skills never fully replaced by the new generation. This decline in pilot quality had a profound impact on the Luftwaffe's combat effectiveness, as young pilots often made mistakes under pressure that their more experienced counterparts would not have. The toll on German pilots was not only physical, but psychological as well. The stress of constant combat, paired with the mounting losses, began to wear down morale. Many pilots were sent on back-to-back missions, rarely given the time to recover from the grueling demands of aerial combat. The psychological impact of these conditions was profound, with many pilots reporting feelings of exhaustion and fear as they returned to the front day after day. Those who survived the brutal campaigns began to question the leadership that had led them into this untenable situation. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's command structure, under constant pressure, began to fracture. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge the changing circumstances of the air war made it difficult for his generals to address the realities of the situation. The Führer continued to demand ever greater efforts from his air force, often without regard for the resources at their disposal. This tension between the need for strategic adjustment and Hitler's insistence on victory at any cost further strained the Luftwaffe. Hitler, who had once believed in the invincibility of his military forces, was reluctant to entertain the possibility that the tide of the war had turned against Germany. This disconnect between Hitler's expectations and the grim reality faced by his commanders led to dangerous miscalculations. The Luftwaffe was now engaged in a battle of attrition that it could not sustain. The constant strain on resources meant that production could not keep up with losses, and the failure to properly train and replace pilots only exacerbated the situation. The leadership within the Luftwaffe, while still capable, was hampered by Hitler's refusal to make the difficult decisions that might have mitigated the damage. As the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe's strain became more evident, and it was clear to anyone with insight into the situation that the once proud force was no longer capable of maintaining its dominance in the skies. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer the aggressive force that had swept across Europe in the early years of the war. The relentless attrition of men, aircraft, and morale had taken its toll. Hitler's generals, who had tried to warn him of the dangers of overstretching their forces, now found themselves unable to reverse the damage. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect German skies from the growing Allied air supremacy marked a significant turning point in the war, one that would have profound consequences for Germany's military strategy moving forward. It was clear now that, despite the German Air Force's initial successes, it was no longer the sole, overwhelming force it once had been, and the repercussions of this failure would soon be felt on the ground. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him, the rhetoric of victory. In a lavish room within the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's generals presented the Führer with more optimistic reports, each one a polished picture of success. But beyond the polished surface of their words lay a war machine that had begun to fracture, and the sky itself was speaking a different language. As the war progressed into 1943, Germany's military situation became increasingly untenable. But Hitler's inner circle, reluctant to openly contradict him, continued to feed him reports that painted a rosy picture of the Third Reich's progress. These reports were crafted with careful attention to detail, designed to mask the reality of a war machine that was beginning to unravel. The generals, many of whom knew better, had learned how to speak to Hitler's insecurities and egos, masking their doubts behind a facade of carefully chosen rhetoric. But the reality was far different from the upbeat briefings given in the Führer's presence. The war effort, which had been characterized by rapid, decisive victories in the early years, was no longer the well-oiled machine it once had been. The Wehrmacht's forces were stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts, in the east against the Soviet Union, in North Africa, and in the west where the Allies were increasingly pressing the Germans. The once vaunted blitzkrieg tactics had lost much of their effectiveness against well-equipped, determined adversaries, and the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain large-scale offensives was severely impaired. In particular, the Soviet Union had proven far more resilient than Hitler had anticipated. The failure to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941 and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensives had left the German army mired in a prolonged and brutal campaign on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's supply lines were stretched thin, and the casualties were mounting. Yet, in their briefings to Hitler, the generals focused on the few victories that remained, often omitting the devastating losses and the prolonged stalemate that had begun to define the Eastern conflict. In the Mediterranean, the German forces had been pushed out of North Africa by the Allies, and the impending Allied invasion of Italy would open up a new front that would further stretch German resources. But again, Hitler's generals focused on the tactical successes they could present. Small victories here and there that, in their eyes, would bolster the illusion of a Germany still capable of ultimate success. Yet, behind the carefully crafted narratives, the truth of the situation was becoming increasingly apparent. The resources needed to wage a war on multiple fronts were dwindling, and the Luftwaffe's struggle to maintain air superiority was only one symptom of the broader issues facing the Nazi regime, and of the most glaring areas where the rhetoric of victory diverged sharply from the reality on the ground was in the management of logistics. Supplies were increasingly difficult to secure, and the Allied bombing campaigns were making it nearly impossible to transport necessary materials to the front lines. Fuel shortages became a significant problem, as the Allies targeted Germany's oil refineries, while the Luftwaffe was stretched too thin to defend vital industrial hubs. The war effort, once driven by a highly efficient system, was slowly grinding to a halt under the weight of constant attrition. Despite these challenges, Hitler remained consumed by the belief that victory was still possible, as long as his generals presented him with reports that reinforced this notion. His arrogance and refusal to accept the reality of Germany's diminishing prospects made it impossible for him to see that the war machine was in serious jeopardy. He remained convinced that any temporary setback could be overcome with more aggressive tactics, more fervent devotion to the cause, and greater leadership, but this was increasingly at odds with what was actually unfolding. The sky, however, was beginning to tell a different story. As the Allies' air forces continued to dominate, their strategic bombing campaigns deep into German territory left an indelible mark on the nation's war effort. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and the industrial centers that had once powered Germany's military machine were rendered inoperable. The Allies' superiority in the air meant that the Germans could no longer launch large-scale offensive campaigns with the same confidence they once had. The losses to the Luftwaffe, both in terms of aircraft and experienced pilots, made it increasingly difficult to mount effective counterattacks. Yet, even in the face of these losses, the generals continued to present reports that adhered to Hitler's delusional optimism. They spoke of isolated successes and downplayed the devastating effects of the bombing raids. They described the ongoing battles as part of a larger, still achievable plan for victory, even as the foundations of the Third Reich's war machine began to crumble. This disparity between the rhetoric of victory and the harsh realities of war would ultimately be one of the key factors that led to Germany's downfall. Hitler, unable or unwilling to accept the truth, clung to the narrative spun by his generals, even as the very forces they failed to address were tearing apart the fabric of the Nazi war effort. As the days turned into months, the generals knew, deep down, that the war was no longer winnable. But they continued to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear, all the while watching as Germany's fate sealed itself in the skies above and on the ground below. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The meeting that changed everything. On the morning of July 17, 1943, Hitler met with his generals to discuss the situation. The tension in the air was palpable, as Goering confidently reassured the Führer, but the cracks were showing. The war was no longer a matter of if, but when. The meeting would mark the beginning of a transformation, one that would force the German High Command to confront the truth. By mid-1943, the Third Reich was on the defensive, caught between the relentless pressure of the Soviet counteroffensive in the east and the mounting strength of the Allies in the west. Hitler, who had spent years dictating the war effort from his command bunker, was still clinging to the belief that victory could be achieved if only his commanders would push harder, fight more fiercely, and follow his grand vision. But the reality of the situation was unmistakable, and on that summer morning in the Reich Chancellery, even his most loyal generals could no longer ignore the grim truth. The meeting began, as many others had, with Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, delivering his usual confident assurances. He painted a picture of ongoing success, emphasizing the strength of the Luftwaffe and the German military's ability to recover from setbacks. But as the meeting wore on, cracks began to appear in his rhetoric. Goering's usual bravado was laced with defensiveness, and he became more hesitant in his assertions. The Luftwaffe's losses, which had been mounting for months, could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or temporary disruptions. The air superiority that Germany had once enjoyed was slipping away, and even Goering, who had long projected an image of unwavering control, could no longer deny the toll the war was taking on Germany's military. Hitler, ever the dictator, refused to acknowledge the growing hopelessness. His fury intensified as his generals began to express their concerns. While many of them still attempted to present a facade of optimism, the tension in their voices and the resignation in their eyes spoke volumes. It was clear that the optimism of past briefings was no longer believable. The situation was deteriorating on both the eastern and western fronts, and the Luftwaffe, which had once been the pride of the Nazi war machine, was now on the defensive, unable to stem the tide of Allied bombers that had been ravaging German cities and factories. General Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, was one of the first to break from the carefully constructed narrative of victory. He presented a sobering analysis of the situation on the Eastern Front, acknowledging that the Wehrmacht's ability to hold back the Soviet offensive was quickly eroding. The battle for Stalingrad, which had seemed so promising in the early stages of the war, had turned into a devastating defeat, and the Soviet army was now pushing westward with renewed vigor. Halder's words were blunt, yet they carried an unmistakable gravity. The German army was running out of time and resources, and a victory in the East now seemed increasingly out of reach. Despite the mounting evidence that the war was slipping from Germany's grasp, Hitler continued to react with disbelief and anger. He refused to accept that his vision of a German-dominated Europe was unraveling before his eyes. His generals, who had spent years telling him what he wanted to hear, were now reluctantly confronting the truth. They could no longer afford to maintain the illusion of a forthcoming victory, and their silence spoke volumes. But even as they acknowledged the grim reality, they were caught in the bind of loyalty to their Führer and the awareness of the impending collapse of Nazi Germany. The meeting was a turning point, the moment when the facade of invincibility that Hitler had surrounded himself with began to crack. His generals, who had long fed him false assurances, were now forced to speak openly about the military's failures, even though doing so risked their careers, or worse. They were beginning to realize that their loyalty to Hitler had brought them to the brink of disaster. The truth could no longer be ignored. The war was lost, but Hitler's refusal to confront that fact would send Germany down a path that would only hasten its destruction. In the aftermath of the meeting, the mood within the German High Command was different. There was no longer any doubt that the tide of the war had turned irrevocably against them. The realization had set in. Germany's military strategy, its leadership, and even its morale were all in a state of disarray. Despite the bitter truth, however, Hitler remained in denial, determined to continue the fight, even as the Allies and the Soviets closed in from all sides. The meeting of July 17, 1943, would come to symbolize the moment when the last illusion of victory was shattered. Hitler's generals could no longer deceive themselves, and they could no longer deceive him. The day of reckoning had arrived, but for the Führer, the hardest part was yet to come, accepting that the war was lost, and with it, the very future of Nazi Germany. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The Great Deception. The lies were not just about statistics and victories. They were about something much deeper. At the heart of the deception was the narrative that Germany had not just been fighting a war of survival, but a war of inevitable triumph. The idea that the Luftwaffe was invincible was the cornerstone of Nazi propaganda, but reality was fast shattering that illusion. From the very beginning of the war, the Nazi regime had crafted a narrative that portrayed Germany as an unstoppable force, destined to rule Europe and beyond. At the center of this myth was the idea of technological and military superiority, especially in the realm of air power. The Luftwaffe, with its swift blitzkrieg tactics, had been one of the most formidable military forces in the world. The image of the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies was a core part of Nazi propaganda, used to rally these German public and instill fear in their enemies. But as the war progressed, particularly by mid-1943, this carefully constructed image of invincibility began to unravel. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, was being pushed to its limits. The relentless Allied bombing campaigns had taken a heavy toll on its resources. German cities were being bombed into oblivion, and industrial centers, crucial to the war effort, were systematically destroyed. The Luftwaffe, unable to mount a successful defense against the overwhelming numbers of Allied bombers and fighters, had become a mere shadow of its former self. Despite this, Hitler's inner circle, including Göring, continued to perpetuate the myth of its invincibility, masking the truth with half-truths and empty boasts. But it wasn't just the facts about the Luftwaffe's capabilities that were being twisted. It was the entire framework of the war itself. The Nazi regime had fostered a belief in the German people that they were not simply fighting for survival, but for an inevitable victory. This narrative, grounded in Hitler's ideological vision of a greater Germany, suggested that the war's outcome was preordained. The idea that Germany would ultimately triumph was deeply embedded in Nazi propaganda, creating a dangerous sense of invulnerability. The German public, in large part, believed in this rhetoric, bolstered by the constant stream of victories during the early stages of the war. Hitler, too, became increasingly convinced of this narrative. He often ignored or dismissed the warnings of his generals, preferring to believe that Germany was on the brink of ultimate victory. His refusal to face the truth about the war's shifting dynamics led him to ignore the growing evidence of failure. As the situation worsened, Hitler continued to rely on a false sense of optimism, clinging to the belief that the tide could still be turned. His generals, caught between their loyalty to the Führer and their own awareness of the unfolding disaster, found themselves complicit in perpetuating this dangerous illusion. The deception also extended to the state of the German military itself. The Wehrmacht, despite its early successes, was now facing severe logistical challenges. Supplies were dwindling, and soldiers were stretched thin across multiple fronts. Yet, the High Command, in an effort to preserve morale and avoid panic, continued to report that Germany was making progress. These reports, often exaggerated or outright false, were crafted to maintain the facade of success. The narrative of inevitable triumph was maintained at all costs, even as the situation on the ground became more desperate. The Great Deception wasn't just a tool to manipulate the public, it was a way of keeping the German leadership and military in line. By continuing to promote the idea of an invincible Germany, Hitler ensured that his generals and advisors remained loyal to his vision, even when they knew the truth. It was a dangerous game, one that would ultimately lead to catastrophic consequences. The longer the deception continued, the more deeply entrenched the belief in victory became, blinding the leadership to the reality of their situation. But the cracks in this illusion were impossible to ignore for much longer. By the summer of 1943, the effects of the Great Deception were becoming undeniable. The Luftwaffe was no longer a dominant force in the sky, and Germany's military strength was rapidly diminishing. Hitler's generals, many of whom had been part of the deception, began to confront the truth. The reality of a war that was no longer winnable was staring them in the face. Yet, even in this moment of reckoning, Hitler clung to the belief that Germany could still prevail. His refusal to accept the inevitable was a reflection of his deep ideological convictions and his unwillingness to confront failure. The impact of the Great Deception on Nazi Germany's military and political structure was profound. It created an environment where the truth was actively suppressed, and the leadership, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, continued to live in denial. As a result, Germany was doomed to fight a war it could not win, with a leader and a military command unwilling to adapt to the changing realities of the conflict. The lies that had sustained the Nazi regime's early successes ultimately became the very factors that led to its downfall. By the time Hitler and his generals could no longer ignore the truth, it was too late. The war was lost, and Germany's fate was sealed. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The reality of the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was a far cry from the propaganda that had been spread across Germany. German pilots found themselves constantly outnumbered, struggling against an increasingly well-equipped Soviet Air Force. The vastness of the Russian landscape offered little in the way of safe haven. The truth of the Luftwaffe's failures was buried beneath piles of fallen comrades. When Germany first launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, it was with the belief that victory was imminent. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics had been devastatingly effective in Western Europe, and Hitler was confident that the same success would follow in the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe, integral to the early stages of the operation, had swiftly taken control of the skies over Eastern Europe, providing crucial support to the advancing ground forces. But as the war dragged on, the reality of the Eastern Front began to expose the weaknesses of the Nazi military machine. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer the dominant force it had once been. The Soviet Union, having suffered greatly in the early months of the war, was now rebuilding its military capabilities at an astonishing rate. The Soviet Air Force, once under-equipped and largely ineffective, had undergone a rapid transformation. With the help of massive industrial production and the strategic relocation of factories further east, the Soviets had begun to field a new generation of aircraft, including the iconic Yak-3 and Ela-5 fighters. These planes, while not necessarily superior to German aircraft in every respect, were numerous and well-coordinated, giving the Soviet Air Force the ability to challenge the Luftwaffe's supremacy in the skies. In contrast, the Luftwaffe found itself stretched thin, operating in a theater that was both vast and unforgiving. The Soviet Union's immense size, combined with its harsh weather conditions and shifting front lines, presented logistical challenges that the Germans were unprepared to handle. Unlike the relatively compact battlefields of Western Europe, the Eastern Front offered little in the way of strategic depth or retreat routes. Once a German pilot entered Soviet airspace, there was often nowhere to hide. The rear bases, already stretched to their limits, were vulnerable to Soviet airstrikes, further complicating supply lines and forcing the Luftwaffe to operate with fewer resources. The Luftwaffe's losses were mounting at an alarming rate. Experienced pilots were being killed or captured in ever greater numbers, while new recruits, many of whom lacked the necessary training, were thrown into combat with little more than basic knowledge of aerial tactics. The result was a staggering attrition rate that left the Luftwaffe increasingly ineffective. The Soviet Air Force, bolstered by a continuous supply of new aircraft and better-trained pilots, began to systematically chip away at the German aerial advantage. Even more troubling for the Germans was the shifting nature of the fighting. The Luftwaffe had been designed to support rapid offensives, but the grinding nature of the Eastern Front, marked by fierce, prolonged engagements, was not conducive to the Luftwaffe's usual tactics. The front lines were constantly in flux, with the Germans losing ground as the Soviets launched massive counteroffensives. The Luftwaffe, once capable of maintaining dominance over German-held territories, now found itself defending German positions, often with insufficient air cover. By 1943, the war in the East had become a war of attrition, one in which the Luftwaffe, already overstretched and undermanned, could not compete. Soviet air superiority had begun to encroach upon German-held territory, particularly in the southern regions where key battles like the Battle of Kursk were taking place. German pilots, once hailed as some of the best in the world, now found themselves on the defensive, struggling to maintain control of the skies against a well-organized and determined Soviet Air Force. The propaganda machine in Germany, however, continued to present an image of victory. The German public, fed a constant stream of positive reports from the front, had little understanding of the dire situation unfolding in the East. Hitler, who had long been enamored with the idea of the Wehrmacht's invincibility, refused to believe that the tide had turned. Even when reports from his generals became more desperate, the Führer remained convinced that victory was still within reach. But the reality on the Eastern Front was undeniable. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority over the Soviets was a stark indication that Germany was losing its grip on the war. The massive losses in both men and machines were taking their toll, and it became clear that the Wehrmacht could not sustain the conflict. Yet Hitler's insistence on continuing the fight, regardless of the mounting evidence of failure, meant that the truth was often hidden behind a veil of optimistic rhetoric. The Luftwaffe's inability to cope with the growing Soviet threat was just one of many signs that the war was slipping from Germany's grasp. As the Soviet Union regained ground and the Germans were pushed back further, it became apparent to those on the front lines that the Luftwaffe could no longer be relied upon to tip the balance of the war. The illusion of a powerful, invincible air force was crumbling, and with it, the myth of Germany's inevitable victory. The reality of the Eastern Front was clear. Germany's war effort was unraveling, and no amount of propaganda could mask the truth any longer. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The changing face of the B-17. The B-17 Flying Fortress was more than just a bomber. It had become a symbol of Allied determination, a relentless armored giant that could not be stopped. As it roared through the skies over Europe, its defensive capabilities slowly began to wear down the once feared Luftwaffe. The Germans had underestimated the power of American innovation. When the B-17 Flying Fortress first entered combat in 1941, the Luftwaffe viewed it with a mixture of contempt and skepticism. While German pilots were accustomed to fighting smaller, faster bombers, the B-17 was something entirely different. Heavily armed and armored, the B-17 was designed to absorb damage and still complete its mission. Initially, the German command believed that the American bomber could be easily neutralized by fighter interceptors or anti-aircraft fire. But they quickly learned that the B-17's unique design and capabilities had changed the very nature of strategic bombing. Unlike many other bombers, which relied on speed and evasion, the B-17 used its formidable defensive armament to deter attackers. Armed with up to 13 .50 caliber machine guns strategically placed throughout the aircraft, the B-17 created a nearly impenetrable zone of fire around itself. This flying fortress was designed to fly in tight formations, which provided mutual protection for the bombers. Each bomber in a formation would cover the others with overlapping fields of fire, creating a network of defense that German fighters struggled to breach. The Luftwaffe's initial underestimation of the bombers' capabilities proved to be a critical mistake. At first, the Germans believed that the B-17 could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, sending waves of fighters to break through the bomber formations. However, they quickly realized that even when the German fighters managed to close in on a B-17, they were faced with intense, coordinated resistance from the bomber's defensive guns. The bomber's ability to fly at high altitudes also made them difficult targets for many German fighters, whose performance often suffered at those heights. As a result, the Luftwaffe's attempts to take down the B-17 were costly, and the bombers' crews quickly adapted to the increasingly lethal environment they found themselves in. As the Allies ramped up their strategic bombing campaign in 1943, the B-17 became an even more critical tool in their arsenal. The American 8th Air Force, flying from bases in England, launched regular raids over Germany and occupied Europe. Their primary target was Germany's industrial infrastructure, which was vital to the Nazi war effort. But the Germans, who had once prided themselves on their control of the skies, were finding it increasingly difficult to defend against the wave of American bombers. The Luftwaffe's response was to deploy more advanced and aggressive tactics, but it was clear that the B-17 was no longer an easy target. German fighter pilots, once feared for their skill and agility, were finding themselves outmatched by the B-17's heavy firepower and the escorts provided by the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. These fighter escorts, designed to protect the bombers on long-range missions, made it increasingly difficult for the Luftwaffe to break through the formations. As the bombing raids intensified, the Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses. The once dominant German Air Force found itself unable to defend its own airspace effectively. The B-17's ability to survive against intense opposition, combined with its heavy payload of bombs, had begun to shift the balance of power in the skies. The Luftwaffe's failure to neutralize the B-17s became a symbol of the broader decline of German air superiority. The bomber, which had initially been underestimated, was now a key factor in the Allies' aerial dominance. But the B-17 was not invincible. Despite its formidable defenses, it was still vulnerable to concentrated attacks from well-coordinated German fighters. Many bombers were lost in these engagements, and the high attrition rate took a toll on the crews. Yet, the fact that the B-17 could endure such losses and still deliver devastating blows to German targets demonstrated the resilience and effectiveness of American air power. The bomber's ability to return to base after taking heavy damage, sometimes with large portions of its structure missing, became a powerful testament to American ingenuity and industrial capacity. The B-17's transformation from a tool of war to a symbol of Allied resilience and determinations had profound implications for the war effort. It was no longer just a bomber. It had become a powerful psychological weapon, striking fear into the hearts of the Germans. The sight of a B-17 flying high over Europe became a symbol of the changing tide of the war. The once feared Luftwaffe, which had dominated Europe for years, was now struggling to defend against the relentless assault of Allied bombers. For Hitler and his generals, the reality of the B-17's impact was a bitter blow to their sense of invincibility. The narrative that Germany's air force could control the skies over Europe was increasingly difficult to maintain. The B-17, along with the growing power of the Allied air forces, was a direct challenge to the Luftwaffe's once unassailable dominance. The Germans had underestimated the power of American innovation, and by 1943, it was clear that the B-17 and the strength of Allied air power had irrevocably altered the course of the war. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. A fighter pilot's grit. Over the fields of France, a young German pilot, his hands trembling on the controls, faced the reality of what had become of the Luftwaffe. His aircraft had been patched together after countless sorties. The air was thick with enemy fighters, and the sky was growing darker with each passing day. There was no glory in this fight, only survival. By mid-1943, the once feared Luftwaffe, the pride of Nazi Germany, had descended into a state of constant attrition. The young German pilot, thrust into the chaos of a war that was now clearly slipping away from his country, felt the weight of the Luftwaffe's desperate fight. The Luftwaffe had been stretched thin, and the young pilot was just one of many who were forced to carry the burden of a military machine that had outlived its effectiveness. What was once an elite fighting force, capable of controlling the skies over Europe, was now struggling to maintain even a semblance of control. The pilot's aircraft, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, was a sturdy machine that had once been the envy of the world. But now, after months of combat and repairs, it was barely recognizable. The paint had chipped away in patches, and the fuselage bore the scars of countless engagements. His engine sputtered, a grim reminder of how stretched the Luftwaffe's resources had become. Each time he returned to base, the aircraft would be patched up, a temporary fix that allowed him to fly one more mission before the inevitable breakdown. It was a far cry from the powerful, sleek fighters that had flown during the early days of the war, but despite the mechanical challenges, it was the mental toll that weighed most heavily on the young pilot. Each mission was more grueling than the last. He had once been told that the Luftwaffe's superiority in the skies would guarantee victory. Now he was fighting a losing battle, surrounded by Allied bombers escorted by nimble fighters. The sky above Europe had become a deadly battlefield where survival was the only objective. There was no room for heroism or triumph, only the bitter realization that every flight might be his last. The overwhelming force of Allied air power had made it increasingly difficult for the German pilots to defend their homeland. The American B-17 Flying Fortresses and British Lancasters, flying in tight formations, would bomb German cities and military targets with impunity, while Allied fighter escorts ensured the bombers' protection. The young pilot had been trained to fight in the sky with a sense of invincibility, but now he faced a much more difficult reality. The Luftwaffe, which had once been the undisputed king of the skies, was now desperately trying to hold on, and it was clear that the Allies were gaining the upper hand. In the midst of these overwhelming odds, the young German pilot had learned the hard truth of warfare. Survival came at a steep price. His comrades, once full of youthful enthusiasm, now spoke little. Many had been lost in dogfights or killed during bombing raids. The mental and physical strain of constant combat had drained them, and what remained was a hardened group of men who fought not for glory, but for the sheer will to make it another day. Each sortie was another chance to avoid death, and each encounter with an enemy fighter was a test of endurance rather than skill. As the war dragged on, the young pilot's spirit began to reflect the overall decline of the Luftwaffe. The once proud Air Force, which had inspired awe across Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. Its best pilots were gone, and replacements were thrown into the fray with minimal training. The high casualty rates meant that few were able to survive long enough to gain the experience necessary to turn the tide of the war. The pilot's hands, once steady with confidence, now shook with exhaustion and fear. He had witnessed too many of his comrades fall, and the prospect of returning to the skies filled him with a sense of dread rather than anticipation. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect German airspace, and the Allies were systematically dismantling the German war effort. The young pilot, though loyal to his country and his comrades, could no longer reconcile the grim reality of the situation with the promises of victory that had been drummed into his head. There was no glorious end to this war, no moment of redemption that would change the tide. The sky above France had become a battleground for survival, and the young pilot's only hope was that he would make it through another day. The toll of these repeated, exhausting missions was not just physical, but psychological as well. The pressure, the loss of comrades, and the overwhelming sense that they were fighting a losing battle weighed heavily on the young pilot's mind. The Luftwaffe had been the backbone of Nazi Germany's early military successes, but by 1943, the fight was no longer about military might. It was about holding on to the very last vestiges of power and hope. The changing face of the Luftwaffe was embodied in the weary eyes of that young pilot, who, like so many others, had been forced to confront the devastating truth. The war, once thought to be winnable, was slipping beyond Germany's reach the day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. Hitler's wrath. The day after the disastrous raid over the Ruhr Valley, Hitler confronted his generals. His anger echoed through the walls of the Reich Chancellery, cutting through the bravado of his senior officers. The Führer's realization that his air force was crumbling was slow but inevitable. He was no longer being fed optimism, he was being told the truth. For months, Hitler had clung to the belief that his military forces, particularly the Luftwaffe, could still secure victory despite mounting setbacks. His generals had continued to offer carefully crafted reports, giving him just enough reassurance to avoid confronting the disastrous reality that was unfolding. But the raid over the Ruhr Valley in early 1943 was a turning point. The destruction of vital industrial targets combined with the mounting losses in the air forced the truth into the open. The Luftwaffe was no longer capable of defending Germany's skies, and Hitler, who had long rejected the possibility of failure, was faced with a reality that was becoming impossible to ignore. When Hitler entered the Reich Chancellery on the morning of the meeting, he was already consumed with rage. His disappointment was not only about the loss of territory but about the shattering of his carefully constructed vision of German invincibility. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, had been humbled by the Allies' relentless strategic bombing campaigns. The relentless pressure of American and British bombers, combined with the steady decline of German fighter aircraft, had driven the Luftwaffe into a defensive position it had never been prepared for. In Hitler's eyes, this was not just a military failure. It was a personal betrayal. The meeting, which was intended to discuss strategies to recover from the mounting airstrikes, quickly spiraled into a confrontation between Hitler and his generals. For the first time in the war, the senior officers of the Luftwaffe were forced to confront the truth in front of the Führer. Gone were the confident assertions of past briefings, replaced with somber admissions of failure. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring, once a close confidant of Hitler and a symbol of Nazi air power, could no longer offer assurances. His earlier bravado, in which he had confidently declared that the Luftwaffe would defend the skies at all costs, had been exposed as hollow. The grim reports of lost aircraft, dwindling pilot numbers, and an inability to protect German cities from Allied bombers made it clear that the Luftwaffe was crumbling under the pressure. Hitler's fury was palpable. His hands shook with rage as he accused his generals of incompetence, of failing to understand the gravity of the situation, and of misleading him with false reports. His voice thundered through the room as he demanded to know why the Luftwaffe had not been able to prevent the devastation of the Ruhr Valley and other strategic targets. The generals, who had long been accustomed to catering to Hitler's desires, were now confronted with the full extent of his anger. They could no longer shield him from the truth. The Luftwaffe, the backbone of Nazi air power, had been broken, and there was no immediate solution on the horizon. For Hitler, the realization was a bitter one. His air force, which had been his pride, was no longer a tool of German superiority. The Allies, with their increasing numbers of bombers and fighters, had seized control of the skies. The strategic bombing campaigns were having a devastating effect on Germany's ability to sustain the war. The loss of the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, was a blow that would reverberate throughout the war effort. Hitler's arrogance had led him to underestimate the capabilities of the Allies and overestimate the strength of his own forces. Now, in the face of undeniable failure, he was forced to reckon with the reality that his military strategy was faltering. The generals, for their part, were now trapped between their duty to their Führer and the grim reality they had long been trying to avoid. They knew that Germany's position in the war was deteriorating, but they also knew that openly admitting failure would be disastrous. They had spent years feeding Hitler false hopes, telling him that victory was just around the corner, that the Luftwaffe would rebound, and that Germany's forces could still crush the Allies. Now, they were being forced to tell him the truth. The Luftwaffe was on the brink of collapse, and there was little that could be done to turn the tide. As the meeting continued, the mood shifted from confrontation to resignation. Hitler, though still consumed by his fury, began to grasp the full extent of the Luftwaffe's failure. But even as his generals offered their candid assessments of the situation, it was clear that the Führer was unwilling to accept the reality. He continued to demand more from his military leadership, blaming them for the setbacks rather than confronting the deeper flaws in his own approach to the war. The outcome of the meeting was a clear indication that the Luftwaffe, and by extension Nazi Germany, was facing an irreversible decline. Hitler's wrath, fueled by his own hubris and refusal to face the truth, would only push the generals into further compliance. Yet their collective understanding of the military situation had reached a breaking point. The cracks in Nazi leadership were becoming more visible, but the Führer's refusal to adjust to reality would continue to doom Germany's war effort. The disastrous raid over the Ruhr Valley marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's dominance. It was a symbol of the growing weakness of Nazi Germany and a pivotal moment in the broader collapse of the Third Reich's military power. The day after that raid, Hitler's generals were no longer lying to him, but the consequences of their falsehoods had already sealed their fate. The fall of the Luftwaffe's defenses. By the summer of 1943, Allied bombers were being escorted by long-range fighters, making daylight raids a deadly new reality for the Luftwaffe. The once impenetrable barrier of German fighters seemed to vanish, and the sky began to fill with flames and smoke, as German aircraft fell from the sky in droves. This marked a significant turning point in the air war over Europe. The Luftwaffe, which had been the most powerful and effective air force in the world at the beginning of the war, was now facing a crisis of its own making. As the Allies steadily gained the upper hand in the skies, Adolf Hitler's faith in his generals began to erode. The German High Command had long promised that the Luftwaffe could repel any attack, but by mid-1943, it was becoming increasingly clear that this was no longer the case. The repeated failures to prevent the destruction of German cities, factories, and oil refineries exposed the lie that the Luftwaffe was invincible. What had started as a bold strategy of air superiority was now unraveling under the pressure of sustained Allied raids. Hitler's increasing frustration with his generals reached a boiling point in the summer of 1943. He had always been a micromanager, prone to involving himself in military decision-making at the most granular level. However, as the situation grew worse, his interference became more disruptive. The collapse of the Luftwaffe's defenses was not merely a blow to German air power, it was a direct challenge to Hitler's authority and vision for the war. His confidence in his leadership and his generals' capabilities began to falter. The Luftwaffe's early successes had created a false sense of invulnerability. When the war began, Germany's air forces had a distinct advantage in technology and tactics, but as the Allies adapted, the weaknesses of the Luftwaffe became apparent. German pilots were heavily outnumbered, and the defensive capabilities of their aircraft were being surpassed by the long-range fighters the Allies were deploying. The Luftwaffe was caught off guard by the rapid development of Allied air power. What had once been an overwhelming advantage in the air was now turning into a deadly disadvantage. As the bombing raids grew more frequent and destructive, the cracks in the Luftwaffe's defenses became impossible to ignore. The inability to stop the Allies' bombing campaigns was not just a tactical failure, it was a strategic disaster. Hitler's generals, who had been promising him victory for years, were now scrambling to explain the mounting losses. The Germans' failure to adapt to new tactics and technology in the face of changing warfare strategies became all too clear. In the aftermath of each failed defensive operation, Hitler began to question the competence of his commanders. His fury grew as he watched the skies above Germany darken with smoke from burning factories and the bodies of fallen Luftwaffe pilots. The once proud Luftwaffe, which had once been a symbol of German military superiority, was now failing on all fronts. The destruction of their aircraft, combined with the increasing number of Allied planes that went unchallenged, marked the moment when Hitler realized the full scale of his generals' deception. Hitler's reaction was swift and brutal. He blamed his commanders for the losses and demanded immediate action. The Luftwaffe was to be reorganized, new tactics were to be implemented, and more resources were to be allocated to rebuild its shattered forces. The generals, who had been accustomed to deflecting blame and painting a rosy picture of the war effort, now found themselves under intense scrutiny. Hitler's orders were often contradictory, demanding faster results without fully understanding the practical limitations of the Luftwaffe's capabilities. Yet, despite his interference, the damage was already done. The Luftwaffe's defenses had fallen, and the skies of Europe had become a battleground where Germany's air superiority was no longer a reality. This moment marked a significant shift in the war. The Luftwaffe was no longer the force it once was, and the Allies had gained a decisive edge in the air. Hitler's once unshakable confidence was now shaken, and his generals knew that their position within the German military was precarious. The downfall of the Luftwaffe's defenses in 1943 was not just a tactical failure. It was the beginning of the end for Germany's ability to fight a successful war on multiple fronts. The lies of the German High Command had been exposed, and the war was never going to be the same again. The cost of arrogance, Göring's self-confidence, had led to one of the greatest military blunders of the war. In his dismissal of the growing threat posed by Allied bombers and fighters, he had given the Luftwaffe a false sense of invincibility. Now, as the Allies' bombing campaign intensified, that arrogance was coming back to haunt them. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe was struggling to maintain its position in the sky, as the once dominant force had become increasingly ineffective against the relentless assaults of Allied bombers and their long-range escorts. The price of Göring's hubris, however, was not just the loss of aircraft. It was the erosion of trust within the German High Command, and, most damaging of all, the unraveling of Hitler's strategic vision for the war. Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had long been one of Hitler's most trusted men. His ability to inspire the Luftwaffe in its early successes, particularly during the Blitz and the Battle of France, had earned him Hitler's unwavering support. However, as the war dragged on, Göring's overconfidence became more pronounced. He dismissed the growing effectiveness of Allied air forces, believing that the Luftwaffe could outmaneuver and destroy any threat that came its way. His words to the Führer were often filled with bravado, assuring Hitler that the Luftwaffe would be able to defend Germany against any air raid, no matter how sophisticated the enemy. Yet, by mid-1943, this bravado was beginning to ring hollow as the Allies pressed their advantage. The impact of Göring's arrogance was far-reaching. Under his command, the Luftwaffe had failed to adjust to the changing nature of air warfare. While the Allies adapted to new technologies and tactics, the Luftwaffe continued to rely on outdated strategies that had been successful in the early years of the war. Göring's refusal to acknowledge the threat posed by the new Allied bombers, especially the B-17 Flying Fortress and the long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, proved disastrous. These bombers could now penetrate deep into German territory, unimpeded by the Luftwaffe's once formidable defenses. The fighters, meanwhile, provided vital protection, ensuring that Allied bombers could operate with far greater freedom than ever before. The Luftwaffe's inability to counter this new threat was emblematic of the broader failure of German military leadership. While Göring had been quick to claim credit for the Luftwaffe's early victories, he was equally swift to blame others for its failures. His leadership was characterized by grandiose statements and a refusal to listen to the mounting concerns of his subordinates. As German cities and industrial centers were increasingly targeted by Allied bombers, the Luftwaffe's inability to respond effectively began to erode the trust of the German people and, more importantly, the trust of Hitler himself. Hitler's frustration with Göring reached a breaking point during the summer of 1943. As Allied bombing raids intensified, German cities were laid waste, and the Luftwaffe was unable to provide the kind of protection it had promised. Aircraft losses mounted, and pilots were increasingly outnumbered and outclassed by the Allied forces. Hitler, who had once relied on Goering's reassurances, began to see through the facade. The once glamorous reputation of the Luftwaffe was shattered, and its failures were impossible to ignore. As the Allies began their sustained campaigns, such as the bombing raids on the Ruhr Valley and the devastating attacks on Hamburg, Goering's failure to mount an effective defense highlighted the cost of his arrogance. Instead of taking responsibility for the crisis at hand, Goering shifted the blame to his subordinates and the Luftwaffe's pilots. His public statements, filled with promises of victory and defiance, rang increasingly hollow as they sung. Allies continued to inflict severe damage. His refusal to acknowledge the scale of the disaster only served to deepen the rift between him and the rest of the German High Command. The cost of Goering's arrogance was ultimately paid in blood. Thousands of Luftwaffe pilots lost their lives in futile attempts to counter the ever-growing Allied air superiority. Furthermore, the resources that Germany poured into rebuilding its air force, including the production of new aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter, came too late. These advanced weapons could not compensate for the loss of experienced pilots or the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies. By the time the Luftwaffe could mount a credible defense, the balance of power had already tipped in favor of the Allies. The collapse of Germany's air defenses marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. As the Allies gained control of the skies, Germany's ability to wage war on multiple fronts was severely weakened. The fall of the Luftwaffe's dominance was not just a tactical failure. It was a direct result of Goering's unchecked arrogance and the false sense of invincibility he had fostered. His failure to recognize the changing dynamics of air warfare and the mounting threats posed by the Allies left Germany vulnerable at its most critical juncture. The cost of that arrogance was borne not only by the Luftwaffe but by Germany itself, as the Allies moved ever closer to victory. The defection of the German pilots. Not all German pilots could stomach the lies fed to them. Some, overwhelmed by the losses and brutal conditions, began to question their leadership. The shifting winds of the war saw defections, disillusionment, and a growing realization that the war might be unwinnable, at least not under the command of their generals. The situation in the Luftwaffe had become untenable for many. As the Allies pressed their advantage in the skies, the morale of the German pilots who had once been the most feared in Europe began to plummet. They found themselves questioning not only their generals, but also their own roles in a war that seemed to be slipping beyond Germany's grasp. In the early stages of the war, the Luftwaffe had been a formidable force, revered for its precision, innovation, and ruthless tactics. However, as the war dragged on and the Allies adapted to German strategies, the Luftwaffe found itself on the defensive. Over time, the gap between the promises made by Göring and the reality on the ground widened. The constant flow of casualty reports, the mounting losses of experienced pilots, and the inability to counter Allied air superiority took a profound psychological toll on the Luftwaffe's personnel. More and more, pilots began to realize that their leaders had been less than truthful about the state of the war and the chances of victory. For many, the reality set in during the fateful summer of 1943. The Allies' bombing raids had grown in frequency and intensity, devastating Germany's industrial capacity and infrastructure. The Luftwaffe's responses were increasingly ineffective, and the pilots were sent into the skies with little hope of success. Even the development of new aircraft, such as the Me-262 jet fighter, came too late to stem the tide. Many pilots, particularly those with experience in the early days of the war, felt that they were being sacrificed for a war that was already lost. These men, many of whom had once believed in Hitler's vision for a German-dominated Europe, found themselves questioning not just the competence of their leaders, but the very morality of the war effort. As the tide turned against Germany, the number of defections increased. It wasn't just a matter of battlefield exhaustion. Many pilots were simply unwilling to continue fighting for a cause they no longer believed in. The disillusionment among the Luftwaffe pilots mirrored the broader sentiment within Germany itself. There was a growing recognition that the war was no longer about defending the fatherland, but about sustaining a hopeless struggle led by a dictator whose promises of victory had long since become meaningless. For some, the only escape from the relentless pressure and the mounting losses was to defect. The defections were not always overt. Many pilots simply chose to abandon their posts during missions or when returning from sorties. Some would attempt to make their way to neutral countries, hoping to escape the relentless fighting. Others took more drastic steps, actively seeking to switch sides or, in rare cases, joining the ranks of the Allies. These defections were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of disillusionment that spread throughout the German military. The realization that Germany was losing the war was not confined to the civilian population or the lower ranks of the army. Even the highly trained Luftwaffe pilots, the cream of the German Air Force, began to see the writing on the wall. The German High Command, already under immense pressure from the Allied advances on both the eastern and western fronts, began to face increasing internal unrest. The defection of skilled pilots was a blow that Germany could not afford. The loss of experienced personnel severely crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to defend against Allied bombing raids. The pilots who remained in the service were often younger, less experienced, and less capable of facing the well-coordinated Allied air forces. This only served to further erode the fighting spirit of the Luftwaffe. While the defections were a sign of growing desperation among the pilots, they also reflected a broader moral crisis within the German military. Many pilots who defected could not justify continuing to fight for a regime that had led them into a losing war, one that had cost them so much. The betrayal they felt towards their commanders was deepened by the growing awareness of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Some pilots had long been aware of the brutality of the war, but as the reality of defeat loomed larger, the idea of continuing to serve under Hitler's leadership became intolerable. For these men, defection was not just an act of self-preservation. It was an act of moral rebellion. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe was a shell of its former self. The defections, combined with the mounting losses in the air, left the once proud German Air Force in tatters. The loss of skilled pilots and experienced leaders was irreparable, and the war in the air would never again be in Germany's favor. The Luftwaffe's failure to maintain its edge in the skies marked a turning point in the war, and the defections of its pilots symbolized the collapse of the German military's will to continue the fight. What had started as an air force of unparalleled prowess had become a broken institution, its once feared pilots now among the first to acknowledge the futility of the war. The tipping point. On August 17, 1943, during the bombing raid on the German city of Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe's inability to protect vital targets became brutally clear. It wasn't just the aircraft losses. The loss of morale among the German pilots and ground crews was palpable. It was the day Hitler realized the Germans were no longer in control of the skies. The raid on Schweinfurt, known as Black Thursday, would go down in history as one of the most devastating blows to the German war effort, marking a dramatic shift in the air war and signaling the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's dominance. The raid targeted the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, which were vital to Germany's war machine. The loss of these factories would cripple Germany's ability to produce military vehicles, tanks, and aircraft. The Allies understood the strategic importance of the target, and their bombing campaign was aimed at crippling the very heart of the German economy. However, the Luftwaffe's failure to adequately defend such a critical site underscored the mounting collapse of German air superiority. The scale of the attack was unprecedented. Over 300 American bombers, escorted by long-range fighters, took to the skies, facing off against the Luftwaffe's defenses in what would become a pivotal engagement in the air war. Despite the Luftwaffe's desperate efforts to intercept the bombers, the American forces carried out the mission with devastating precision. More than 60 bombers were shot down, and hundreds more were damaged, but the mission was ultimately successful. The factories in Schweinfurt were severely damaged, and the long-term effects on Germany's war production were catastrophic. However, the significance of the raid was not just in the destruction of infrastructure, it was in the message it sent. The Luftwaffe's inability to effectively defend such an important target was emblematic of its growing ineffectiveness in the face of Allied air power. It was a stark reminder to Hitler that the skies over Germany were no longer safe. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on their aerial superiority, were now on the defensive. The Allies had found a way to circumvent the Luftwaffe's once formidable defenses, and the balance of power in the air had permanently shifted. The defeat at Schweinfurt had far-reaching consequences for the morale of both the Luftwaffe pilots and the broader German military. The pilots, who had already suffered significant losses, were demoralized by the scale of the destruction. The prospect of fighting an enemy that could strike at the heart of Germany with such precision and devastating effect seemed insurmountable. The Luftwaffe's pilots were stretched thin, and many were running out of the stamina and resolve necessary to continue the fight. Their once confident commanders were now seen as unable to stop the tide of destruction from falling on Germany. The atmosphere of fear and confusion only deepened as it became clear that the Allies could strike at will, without meaningful resistance from the Luftwaffe. The impact of Schweinfurt on Hitler's leadership was profound. Up until that point, he had held on to the belief that his military leadership and the strength of the Luftwaffe could still bring victory. His faith in Göring and the Luftwaffe had begun to crack in previous months, but the failure to defend Schweinfurt exposed the extent of the Luftwaffe's vulnerability. The loss was a bitter blow not only to Germany's military capabilities, but to Hitler's confidence in his generals. It was during this time that the cracks in the German leadership structure began to widen significantly. Hitler's reaction to the raid was one of fury and disbelief. He demanded an explanation from Göring and the other high-ranking commanders, but their responses were evasive and unsatisfactory. The inability to halt the Allied bombing campaign, despite repeated assurances from the Luftwaffe's leadership, was a direct blow to Hitler's authority. His generals, who had repeatedly promised victory in the skies, were now exposed as incapable of delivering on their promises. The loss at Schweinfurt highlighted just how far Germany had fallen from its earlier successes in the war. The Allies, in turn, saw the raid as a major success, a turning point in the air war that confirmed their ability to strike deep into Germany without fear of retaliation. The damage to Schweinfurt was severe, and while the Germans managed to repair some of the factories in the following months, the blow to their war production was undeniable. The Allies' continued bombing campaigns would cripple Germany's industrial base and fuel the shift in momentum on both the eastern and western fronts. The bombing of Schweinfurt was not just a tactical defeat for Germany. It was the moment when Hitler realized the air war was no longer in their favor. The defeat symbolized the broader collapse of the Luftwaffe and the beginning of a new phase in the war, where Germany would increasingly struggle to defend its airspace. It marked the moment when the sky, once dominated by German aircraft, was no longer a German domain. The tipping point had been reached. From that day forward, Germany's air defenses would never fully recover, and the reality of an unwinnable war would begin to dawn on Hitler's high command. The limits of technology. The myth of German technological superiority was beginning to unravel. The advanced aircraft that had once struck fear into the hearts of their enemies were now being matched and outclassed by Allied innovations. For every new German fighter, there was an equally effective Allied countermeasure. Technology alone would not win the war. The belief that Germany's superior weaponry, particularly its cutting-edge aircraft and advanced machinery, would turn the tide in its favor was fading fast. By 1943, as the Allies demonstrated their own technological prowess and adaptability, it became evident that the balance of power in the skies was shifting. In the early years of the war, German aircraft were regarded as the pinnacle of aviation technology. Planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, and the Junkers Ju 87 Stuka became symbols of German aerial dominance. These machines were fast, efficient, and lethal. The Luftwaffe had the edge, and its pilots were highly skilled, making it nearly impossible for the Allies to breach German airspace during the early stages of the war. However, as the war progressed, it became clear that Germany's technological lead was not invincible. One of the major turning points in the air war came when the Allies began to develop long-range fighters, most notably the P-51 Mustang. This American fighter, equipped with a more powerful engine and longer operational range than any German aircraft, rendered the Luftwaffe's earlier advantage nearly useless. For the first time, the Allies could escort their bombers deep into German territory without fear of being intercepted by German fighters. The P-51 Mustang's ability to protect bombers from German interceptors marked a significant shift in the strategic air war. The balance of air superiority was tipped in the Allies' favor. The German response to this was to develop new aircraft such as the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. While the jet was faster and more technologically advanced than anything the Allies had, it faced several critical problems that made it less effective than German engineers had hoped. The Me-262 was plagued by reliability issues, and its high speed made it difficult for pilots to engage in dogfights with the more agile Allied fighters. Furthermore, the jet's production was slow, and it arrived too late to alter the course of the war. The Luftwaffe was already suffering from a severe shortage of experienced pilots, and many of those who were flying the newer aircraft lacked the necessary training and skills to make full use of their advanced technology. Meanwhile, the Allies continued to develop new technologies that countered Germany's innovations. The B-17 Flying Fortress, for example, was designed with heavy armor and a formidable array of defensive armament, making it more difficult for German fighters to intercept. The development of radar also gave the Allies a significant advantage in detecting incoming German aircraft, allowing them to better coordinate defenses and target German bombers with greater precision. Additionally, the Allies' ability to mass-produce aircraft in larger quantities gave them a crucial numerical advantage that Germany could not match. The struggle between technological innovation and counter-innovation revealed a fundamental flaw in Germany's wartime strategy: the over-reliance on technology as a means of achieving victory. The German leadership, particularly figures like Hermann Göring, had placed great faith in their technological superiority, believing that the right weapons could change the course of the war. Yet, despite the impressive capabilities of planes like the Me-262, technology alone could not overcome the Allies' superior numbers, better logistics, and increasingly effective tactics. Furthermore, the German war machine suffered from severe resource shortages. Critical materials like aluminum, steel, and oil became increasingly difficult to obtain as the Allies' bombing campaign targeted key industrial sites and transportation hubs. While Germany was developing advanced weapons, it could no longer produce them in sufficient quantities, nor could it maintain the infrastructure necessary to support the massive demands of war. The myth of German technological superiority thus proved to be unsustainable when faced with the reality of the logistical and industrial challenges of total war. The strategic and tactical advantages gained by the Allies in the latter stages of the war made it clear that superior technology was not enough to win the war. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to outproduce the enemy was now as important as technological innovation. The Germans, unable to keep up with the Allies' increasing technological output and the superior organization of their military-industrial complex, began to fall further behind. Hitler's belief in the power of German technology also began to falter. While he had been confident that new weapons could reverse Germany's fortunes, the limits of these technologies became increasingly apparent as the war continued. The Allies' ability to innovate and counter the German advancements showed that no matter how advanced their technology was, without the necessary resources and the ability to adapt, Germany's fate was sealed. The myth of technological superiority had become just that, a myth, and the Germans had no way to escape the consequences of their reliance on it. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying, to him, the pain of realization. Sitting at his desk, Hitler stared blankly at the map of Europe. His generals had spoken in riddles and half-truths, but the evidence of the Luftwaffe's failure was too great to ignore. His empire was collapsing, piece by piece, and the realization hit him like a hammer. His greatest weapon had failed, and with it, his strategy. The cold, hard truth had finally surfaced. The once mighty force that he had placed his trust in, and which had fueled his ambitions, was no longer the invincible force he had imagined. It was now clear to him his generals had misled him, and the consequences of this deception were dire. For months, Hitler had been fed optimistic reports from his high-ranking officers. He had heard of victories, advancements, and the unyielding strength of his military forces. But as the war began to drag on and his empire began to crumble, he couldn't ignore the signs of disarray. The Luftwaffe, once his pride and the backbone of his air superiority, had been stretched thin across multiple fronts, leaving it unable to defend against the Allies' increasingly powerful bombing raids. The losses were mounting, and Hitler's strategic miscalculations were becoming too apparent to dismiss. As he sat at his desk, surrounded by the weight of failure, his mind raced. How had things gone so wrong? The Luftwaffe had been built to dominate the skies, to provide the air cover and tactical superiority needed to support his blitzkrieg strategy. Yet, in the face of overwhelming Allied air power, the Luftwaffe was unable to mount an effective defense. What had once been a symbol of Nazi might had been exposed as fragile, unable to withstand the pressures of modern warfare. But the Luftwaffe's failure was not the only blow. His generals, whom he had trusted implicitly, had failed to tell him the full story. They had been too eager to avoid his wrath, too frightened to admit that the situation on the front lines was dire. Instead of speaking the truth, they had masked the failures with half-truths and exaggerated victories, hoping that the Führer would remain ignorant long enough for them to save face. But now, with the mounting evidence of defeat, the truth was undeniable. In the depths of his frustration, Hitler realized that he had been a prisoner of his own ideology. His relentless pursuit of power, his belief in the invincibility of the German military had blinded him to the realities of the war. He had ignored the advice of those who cautioned against overstretching his forces, and he had been too quick to dismiss the warnings from his generals. In his arrogance, he had believed that victory was inevitable, that his vision for a greater German empire was fated to come to fruition. But now, faced with the crumbling remnants of his military, the bitter truth was inescapable. His empire was falling apart, and it was too late to reverse the tide. The air in the room seemed to thicken with tension as Hitler's mind raced through the implications of his failure. He had spent years building this empire, and now it was slipping away. His generals had failed him, and worse, they had lied to him, allowing him to continue believing in an illusion. The betrayal stung deeply, But it also gave birth to a new realization, the depth of his own responsibility. It was no longer about the lies of his generals. It was about the choices he had made, the decisions he had taken, and the path he had chosen. This was a failure of his own making. As the hours passed, Hitler remained lost in thought, his mind teetering between anger and despair. He had always prided himself on his ability to control his destiny, but now, faced with the destruction of his empire, he could not escape the crushing weight of his decisions. His generals had lied, yes, but in the end, it was his own vision, his own stubbornness that had led to this moment. The pain of realization was immense, a heavy burden that threatened to break him. The truth had come too late, and the damage was irreversible. As Hitler sat there, unable to move, the map of Europe before him seemed to mock him, a silent reminder of how far he had fallen. His empire was crumbling, his dreams were shattering, and the pain of realization had set in. There was no going back now. The war and his place in history would be determined not by the lies of his generals, but by the consequences of his own choices. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The aerial battlefield shifts. By September 1943, the balance in the air had irrevocably shifted. The skies were no longer dominated by German fighters, but by American bombers and British interceptors. In the sky over Europe, the sound of German engines was fading, and the Allies were taking control. This change did not happen overnight, but the cumulative effect of mounting losses and strategic missteps had finally taken its toll. Hitler, once so confident in the supremacy of the Luftwaffe, now watched as his once proud Air Force struggled to keep pace with the growing might of the Allies. For years, the Luftwaffe had been the crown jewel of Nazi military power. Its early successes during the Blitzkrieg campaigns had been instrumental in Germany's rapid victories. The precision of its bombing runs, the speed of its fighters, and the strategic advantage it provided on the ground had been key to Hitler's vision of military supremacy. But now, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging aircraft, pilots, and morale. The bombers of the United States and the United Kingdom were increasing in number, their missions becoming bolder and more effective. And worse still, the Luftwaffe was ill-prepared to face this new wave of Allied air superiority. In the skies over Europe, the Allies had learned from their early mistakes. The United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, had developed tactics that minimized losses and maximized the impact of their raids. American bombers, once vulnerable to German fighters, now flew with long-range fighter escorts, and their daylight bombing runs were achieving devastating success. The British, with their radar-guided interceptors and night raids, had evolved their strategies as well. They no longer relied on hit-and-run tactics alone. They had adapted to the challenge of long-term strategic bombing, bringing the war to the heart of Germany itself. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was struggling to adapt. Its fleet of fighters was outclassed by newer Allied aircraft, and its bomber force was stretched thin. The Germans' once dominant Me-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were being outpaced by the sheer numbers and superior tactics of Allied bombers and escorts. The Luftwaffe's inability to provide effective air defense had exposed Germany's vulnerabilities, and the Allies took full advantage. It was during this period of relentless pressure from the skies that Hitler's realization began to take root. He had relied on his generals to provide accurate intelligence, but what he was hearing now no longer matched the evidence in front of him. His generals had insisted that the Luftwaffe could recover, that it would regain its strength and restore Germany's aerial dominance. But the losses mounted, and the Allies continued to push forward. The tide had turned in favor of the enemy, and there was no sign of it reversing. Hitler's faith in the Luftwaffe had been unshakable. He had believed that air superiority was the key to winning the war, and for a time, It had seemed as if his vision was coming true. Yet now, with the bombers of the USAAF wreaking havoc on German industrial sites and civilian infrastructure, the truth was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was no longer the invincible force it had once been. The air superiority that Hitler had relied upon was gone, and with it, so too was the strategy that had once seemed infallible. This loss of control in the skies was not just a tactical setback. It was a blow to Hitler's ego and to his perception of his own invincibility. The Luftwaffe had been his pride, and its failure was a direct challenge to his vision of Germany's future. He had been led to believe by his generals that the Luftwaffe would rise to the occasion. But now it was clear that the Allies had the upper hand. The realization hit him with the force of a bombshell. He had been lied to, and the consequences of this deception were now visible for all to see. As the days passed, Hitler's desperation grew. He knew that the battle for air superiority was over, but the implications of this loss were profound. Without control of the skies, Germany's ground forces were left vulnerable. The Allies could strike with impunity, and Hitler's ability to influence the war from the air was rapidly diminishing. The pain of realization was now compounded by a growing sense of helplessness. His generals had failed him, and the Luftwaffe had crumbled under the weight of the Allied assault. The war had shifted, and Hitler had been left behind in the chaos. The sound of German engines, once a symbol of power, was fading in the skies, replaced by the relentless hum of Allied bombers. The aerial battlefield had shifted irrevocably, and with it, the course of the war had changed forever. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. Göring's last stand. In the final months of 1943, Göring fought to maintain his control over the Luftwaffe. His defiance masked the reality of his failure. His command structure was in tatters, his pilots demoralized, and his strategic vision shattered. But still, he held on, as Hitler's fury simmered beneath the surface. Göring's once unquestioned dominance over Germany's air force had begun to unravel, but his ego refused to acknowledge it. As the Luftwaffe's performance continued to deteriorate, Göring's position became increasingly precarious. Yet he clung to the illusion of strength, determined to present himself as the pillar of Nazi military power. By the end of 1943, it was clear that the Luftwaffe, under Göring's leadership, had suffered catastrophic losses. Allied bombers, unimpeded by German defenses, were inflicting irreparable damage on German industrial centers, transportation hubs, and civilian infrastructure. The skies over Europe were no longer a domain of German superiority. They were filled with American and British bombers, escorted by powerful fighter planes that overwhelmed the Luftwaffe's remaining forces. Göring's strategic miscalculations had left the Luftwaffe exposed, and despite his constant reassurances to Hitler, the damage was undeniable. Göring's once confident demeanor began to crack under the weight of defeat. He had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would win the war, that it would turn the tide of battle. But now, the evidence of his failure was too great to ignore. His pilots were weary, their morale shattered by relentless Allied air raids and the loss of comrades. Many of his best fighter pilots had been shot down, and the replacements were often inexperienced, unable to hold their ground against the skilled Allied forces. Despite his efforts to maintain a facade of control, Göring knew that the Luftwaffe was collapsing from within. At the same time, Hitler's trust in Göring was rapidly eroding. The Führer had always been quick to shift blame when things went wrong, and with the Luftwaffe's failures becoming more pronounced, Göring found himself increasingly isolated. Hitler had once viewed him as a close ally, a man who could help him achieve his grand vision for a victorious Third Reich. But now, Göring's failures were becoming a liability. Hitler's frustration with his once loyal deputy simmered. and he began to consider replacing him with someone who could restore order to the Luftwaffe and salvage what was left of Germany's air defense. Göring's inability to grasp the magnitude of the Luftwaffe's collapse only worsened the situation. He refused to acknowledge the extent of the damage and continued to push for unrealistic strategies that were doomed to fail. He claimed that the Luftwaffe could still fight back, that new weapons and tactics would soon turn the tide in Germany's favor. But those promises rang hollow as the Air Force's losses mounted. The German military, once united under the banner of victory, was now a fractured force, with infighting and blame shifting to avoid responsibility. Behind the scenes, Hitler's anger grew. He knew that Göring's failures had not only cost Germany the war in the air, but also severely weakened the Reich's overall war effort. The Luftwaffe's inability to provide the necessary air support for the Wehrmacht left German ground forces vulnerable to Allied air superiority. Without control of the skies, Germany's military was left exposed, its movements hindered, and its ability to defend critical infrastructure compromised. Hitler could no longer afford to let Göring's arrogance and incompetence go unchecked. Despite his failing position, Göring continued to assert his dominance, even as the Luftwaffe disintegrated. He maintained his grip on power within the Nazi hierarchy, refusing to step down or admit fault. Göring's pride, his need to be seen as the powerful figure who could still lead Germany to victory, kept him in denial of the Luftwaffe's true condition. But his last stand was futile. The Luftwaffe's morale was shattered, its strength diminishing with every passing day. His defiance, though loud and unyielding, could not mask the truth that Germany was losing control of the skies. As Göring's last efforts to restore the Luftwaffe failed, Hitler's fury reached its peak. The man who had once been one of his closest confidants was now viewed with contempt. The realization that Göring had misled him, that his failure had contributed to the larger collapse of Germany's military strength, was too much for Hitler to bear. The consequences of Göring's arrogance were not just personal but national, and Hitler knew that the Luftwaffe's collapse marked a turning point in the war. The skies were no longer German, and Göring's last stand was little more than a desperate, futile attempt to maintain control over a sinking empire. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The irony of the Führer's fist. The fall of the Luftwaffe was a tragedy not only for the German war effort, but for Hitler himself. His once proud vision of air superiority had crumbled, and with it, his confidence in his military leadership. Yet, even as he raged against the truth, the Führer would never admit to the failure that was destroying his war machine. The irony of it all was profound. Hitler, who had risen to power by presenting himself as the iron-fisted leader capable of restoring Germany to greatness, was now facing the devastating collapse of the very vision he had built his empire upon. Once unshakable faith in the superiority of his strategies and his leadership was beginning to fracture. But his refusal to accept responsibility or confront the consequences would be his ultimate downfall. In the wake of the Luftwaffe's collapse, Hitler found himself at a crossroads. The Air Force, once the cornerstone of his military power, had failed to deliver the decisive blows needed to secure victory. The Allies had gained the upper hand in the skies, and Germany's ability to defend its borders and maintain its strategic advantage was rapidly diminishing. The war that had once seemed like a series of inevitable victories now felt like an unwinnable struggle. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence of defeat, Hitler refused to back down. The Führer's response to the failure of the Luftwaffe was not one of reflection or acceptance. Instead, it was one of denial and anger. He lashed out at his generals, blaming them for not executing his orders properly, accusing them of incompetence and treason. He could not bring himself to admit that the core of his military strategy, air superiority, had been fatally flawed from the start. Instead, he clung to the idea that the war could still be won if his commanders simply executed his will with more resolve. The true irony of Hitler's situation lay in the contradiction between his public persona and the reality of his failure. For years, he had projected himself as the embodiment of strength and invincibility, the Führer who could do no wrong. His speeches, full of fiery rhetoric and promises of glory, had inspired a nation to follow him blindly. But now, the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. The Führer's fist, once a symbol of Germany's strength and unity, had lost its power. The very ideology that had driven him to the pinnacle of power, the belief that Germany was destined to dominate Europe, was now collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Hitler's inability to accept his military failures was a direct result of his deep psychological need to maintain control at all costs. He had always believed that his will alone could shape the outcome of the war. His obsession with control extended to every aspect of German life, from the military to the economy to the arts. The idea that a force outside of his control, such as the failure of the Luftwaffe, could undermine his grand vision was inconceivable to him. To admit such a failure would be to admit that his vision was flawed, that his strategic genius had limits. And for a man whose entire identity was bound to the myth of his infallibility, that was an unbearable thought. In the months that followed, Hitler's denial became more pronounced. He refused to acknowledge that the Luftwaffe's collapse was a result of flawed decisions made under his leadership. Instead, he blamed the failure on external factors, on the unrelenting pressure from Allied bombers, on the incompetence of his generals, and on the Hohes, perceived weakness of his soldiers. He clung to the belief that if only his commanders followed his directives more faithfully, victory would be assured. This refusal to confront the truth would ultimately lead to even greater failures. The Luftwaffe was not the only institution in his military structure that was crumbling. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin across multiple fronts, was also beginning to show signs of disintegration. But instead of addressing these systemic issues, Hitler's response was to tighten his grip on power, further isolating himself from the realities of the war. His obsession with control, his need to maintain the image of the infallible Führer, prevented him from seeing the bigger picture. As Germany's situation grew increasingly desperate, the irony of Hitler's leadership became impossible to ignore. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich, the man who had sought to crush all opposition with the iron fist of his will, was now a prisoner of his own delusions. His failure to acknowledge the collapse of the Luftwaffe and the broader failure of his military strategy exposed the fragility of his empire. In the end, the Führer's fist was not a symbol of strength, but of stubbornness and denial, an unwillingness to confront the truth that ultimately led to the destruction of his war machine. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The final echoes. The fall of the Luftwaffe would not be immediate, but by the end of 1943, the sky had changed forever. The echo of German engines had grown faint, drowned out by the rising roar of Allied bombers. It was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. The air was no longer German. Soon, the land would follow. The Allies, once struggling to penetrate German defenses, were now in full control of the skies, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The defeat in the air was not only a strategic failure, it was a symbol of the crumbling of Hitler's vision of invincibility. As the year drew to a close, the landscape of the war had irrevocably shifted. The Allies had begun to unleash devastating bombing raids, targeting not only military installations but also the heart of Germany's industrial might. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich were left smoldering ruins as waves of American and British bombers tore through the skies. These bombings were not random acts of destruction. They were calculated strikes aimed at crippling the very fabric of Germany's war machine. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect these vital centers marked the end of the Third Reich's dominance in the air. Hitler, in his desperate desire to maintain the illusion of control, continued to place his faith in the faltering Luftwaffe. He was unwilling to accept the reality that his once proud Air Force had been thoroughly outclassed. Instead of confronting the consequences of the Luftwaffe's failure, he doubled down on his belief in the invincibility of the German military. Yet, the air battles above Europe told a different story, a story of defeat, of missed opportunities, and of a leadership that was no longer able to adapt to the rapidly changing nature of the war. Despite the growing evidence that Germany's aerial supremacy was over, Hitler's generals, too, played their part in maintaining the facade. They continued to assure the Führer that victory was still possible, that a turn in the tide was just around the corner. But as the bombardments intensified and the Allied air forces became ever more dominant, these assurances rang increasingly hollow. The truth of the situation was clear. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect Germany, and the Allied air forces had gained a decisive advantage in the skies. The echoes of German engines, the sound of planes designed to protect the Reich, grew softer and softer as Allied bombers filled the void. The once feared roar of the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs had been replaced by the shrill, unyielding drone of American B-17s and British Lancasters. The Luftwaffe's once feared interceptors could no longer keep pace with the overwhelming numbers and firepower of the Allies. Each air raid that passed left a deeper scar on Germany's defenses, signaling that the sky, once so firmly in German hands, was slipping away. This shift in the skies mirrored the larger collapse of the Nazi war effort. The same military strategies that had once led Germany to triumph were now leading it into the abyss. It wasn't just the Luftwaffe's inability to secure the skies that marked the beginning of the end. It was the sense of inevitability that began to pervade the German war effort. The collapse of the Air Force left the Reich vulnerable on all fronts. The Allies were no longer limited to distant bombing campaigns. They could now strike deep into German territory, with impunity. The loss of air superiority meant that the Wehrmacht was exposed, its movements hindered by the constant threat of Allied bombardment. The industrial might of Germany was no longer safe from the Allies' reach, and with each passing day the prospects of a German victory grew slimmer. As the final months of 1943 gave way to 1944, the fall of the Luftwaffe became symbolic of the larger collapse of Hitler's military power. The Führer's inability to accept the reality of his loss in the air was mirrored in his refusal to acknowledge the crumbling of his ground forces, his economy, and his strategic vision. The skies, once a battlefield that could be shaped by German will, had now become a space of dominance for the Allies. And with that, the final echoes of the Luftwaffe faded into history. The war was far from over, but the turning point had arrived. The Luftwaffe's failure marked the beginning of a chain reaction, one that would unravel the Nazi war effort piece by piece. Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich, built upon military dominance, was already in its death throes. The skies had been lost, and soon the land would follow. The collapse of Germany's aerial power was not just a military defeat, it was the beginning of the fall of the Third Reich itself. The day Hitler realized his generals were lying to him. The aftermath. After the war, the truth of the Luftwaffe's collapse would be laid bare. The records, the testimonies, the planes, all told the same story. The once feared force had been brought to its knees by the Allied air superiority it had underestimated. And in the darkened halls of the Reich Chancellery, the echoes of Hitler's disbelief would haunt Germany forever. The stark reality of the Luftwaffe's failure was impossible to ignore in the aftermath of the war. It was no longer a matter of propaganda or military missteps. It was a cold, indisputable fact that Allied air forces had decisively shattered German air superiority, signaling the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The war that had once seemed to be progressing toward inevitable German dominance had unraveled, and the Luftwaffe's collapse stood as one of its most telling moments of defeat. The post-war revelations painted a picture of the Luftwaffe in disarray long before the Allies truly gained the upper hand. Through newly accessible records and declassified documents, it became clear that the Luftwaffe's leadership, under Hermann Göring, had never fully recognized the growing threat of Allied air forces. While the Luftwaffe had enjoyed early successes during the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, it failed to adapt to the evolving nature of aerial warfare. In the months that followed, Allied forces learned, adapted, and became increasingly efficient at neutralizing German air threats. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, struggled with inadequate resources, poor morale, and leadership that was increasingly out of touch with the reality on the ground. As the war turned in favor of the Allies, the Luftwaffe found itself stretched thin, its aircraft outdated, and its pilots exhausted. The stunning revelations of the post-war period would show how deeply the Luftwaffe's command structure had failed to prepare for a protracted aerial conflict. The Luftwaffe's once vaunted superiority had been whittled down by a combination of factors: logistical inefficiencies, overstretched resources, and the relentless pressure of Allied air raids. But the most damning truth that emerged was the utter lack of foresight and strategic flexibility from those at the top, including Göring and Hitler himself. They had misled the German public and the military leadership, painting a false picture of strength that kept the truth about the Luftwaffe's collapse hidden for far too long. The Allies, in contrast, understood early on the value of sustained air superiority. Their strategic bombing campaigns targeted not just military installations, but the industrial and logistical networks that sustained the German war effort. The Luftwaffe, unable to mount a consistent defense, saw its ability to protect the Reich's industrial heartland disintegrate. German cities, once bastions of Nazi power, became rubble as Allied bombers relentlessly pounded them into submission. Yet, even as the Luftwaffe's effectiveness dwindled, Hitler and his generals maintained an illusion of victory, promising recovery and an eventual counterattack that would never come. This disconnect between reality and belief in the halls of power only prolonged the inevitable collapse. In the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's denial grew more pronounced as the Luftwaffe's failures mounted. His generals, hesitant to confront him with the harsh truths, continued to offer assurances that they were turning the tide of the air war, even as the evidence of their failure mounted. They, too, were trapped in a system of deception, unable or unwilling to break from the Führer's vision of total victory. This atmosphere of false optimism, combined with Hitler's insistence on control, created a feedback loop of denial. Hitler's rages against the Luftwaffe's failures, his scapegoating of generals, and his refusal to acknowledge the ultimate collapse of the Air Force all contributed to a war effort that was increasingly out of touch with reality. As the war came to a close, the Luftwaffe's true condition became undeniable. The records left behind painted a grim picture of a force that had failed to adapt to the challenges of modern warfare. What was once a dominant force in Europe had become a symbol of Germany's inability to cope with the scale and complexity of the war. The Luftwaffe's failure was one of the central reasons for the crumbling of Hitler's military strategy, as it left Germany vulnerable to the sustained Allied assault from the air and on the ground. The echoes of Hitler's disbelief, the sound of his growing frustration at the collapse of his grand vision, would forever haunt the memories of those who lived through the war. The Luftwaffe's collapse, and Hitler's refusal to accept responsibility for it, became emblematic of the broader failure of Nazi Germany. It was not just the loss of air superiority that led to Germany's downfall. It was the refusal to acknowledge defeat, the clinging to an illusion of power that had long since disappeared. The aftermath of the Luftwaffe's collapse was not just the loss of a military force, but the shattering of the myth of German invincibility that Hitler had so carefully constructed. The truth, as it often does in the aftermath of war, was inescapable, and it would haunt Germany for years to come.